This is BTV World. I am Syed Shabahat Ali and you're watching Fault Lines. The COVID-19 pandemic has given rise to various new popular terms, including vaccine diplomacy, with some countries using their vaccine to strengthen regional ties and enhance their soft power and global status. China's vaccine diplomacy campaign has been a surprising success. It has pledged roughly 500 million doses of its vaccine to more than 45 countries, with just 4 of China's many vaccine makers claiming they are able to produce 2.6 billion doses this year. India has been donating supplies of AstraZeneca produced in its country to regional neighbors, including Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Nepal. Bolstering not only its reputation as a supplier of cheap and accessible vaccine to Global South, but also challenging China's effort at regional dominance at a time of heightened tensions between the two countries. In the recent Quad leaders meeting involving US, India, Japan and Australia was the agreement on expanding the global vaccine supply. The vaccination capacity of India will be increased to produce 1 billion doses by 2022. So, will the vaccine supply emerge as a new fault line? Will the global leaders use it as a tool to bolster their economies and influence? Is US and UK already being outsmarted by China and Russia in this game? Our team has prepared a package. Watch this before I introduce my guests.
3 months after the surfacing of COVID-19 in Wuhan, efforts to develop the vaccine had already begun in full swing. Soon, the United States-based Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine took the lead in midsummer with promising efficacy data and the results of the initial testing. On December the 11th, Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine was the first to be approved by any health regulatory body in the world. With that, other vaccines such as US-based Moderna, UK-based Oxford AstraZeneca, Chinese Sinopharm and Sinovac, Russian Sputnik V, among the others, started rolling in after their emergency approval. Although the vaccine approvals and rollouts was initially aimed at curbing the dangerous pandemic, it was simultaneously a way for the countries to exhibit their pharmaceutical ascendancy. With many wealthy states accused of hoarding vaccines, rising powers such as China and Russia saw a window of opportunity to develop, produce, and supply vaccines to the developing world. China is donating locally produced vaccines to 53 countries, mainly in Southeast Asia and Africa. The first country to get the free vaccines from China was Pakistan. On February the 1st, Pakistan received 500,000 doses of Sinopharm vaccine developed by the state-owned China National Pharmaceutical Group. Sputnik V has also been in great demand, with public-private partnership in Pakistan looking to buy the vaccine. Israel has reportedly agreed to pay Russia to send the Russian-made Sputnik V vaccine to the Syrian government as part of a prisoner exchange deal. However, reaching of the Russian supplies of Sputnik to Hungary was seen as some by an act to undermine European Union unity and credibility. India as well has jumped onto the bandwagon and has already sent out millions of vaccines to the South Asian states such as Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Bhutan, and Maldives. Simultaneously, India's Covaxin is expected to be approved soon. Experts say the efforts can bolster these countries' influence and deepen their ties with the other states. China and Russia have both been accused of the state-backed disinformation campaigns by governments in Europe and North America, which seek to undermine trust in vaccines produced in those regions. However, the United States and European Union have only recently shown interest in sending out vaccines to the developing states, with many accusing them of being selfish. The only question now is how will the vaccine politics unfold, and will the vaccine diplomacy by China, Russia, India, and the likes increase their sphere of influence?
My first guest in the program is Dr. Nikolai Petrovsky, Professor of Medicine at Flinders University, Australia, Principal Investigator for 5 of NIH vaccine contracts, And Dr. Waqar Ahmed, Joint Executive Director of Sustainable Development Policy Institute, is joining me from Quetta. Welcome to the program. Thank you very much, Dr. Nikolai, for joining me from Australia. Tell me, how could these vaccines be developed so early? Because we have learned that all other vaccines in the history of medical science have taken more time than this corona vaccine that was developed so rapidly.
So thank you, Shabahad, for inviting me on Fault Lines tonight. You're correct, this is the fastest vaccine rollout in history. And the reason that it's been able to be so fast is, we've been predicting a pandemic of this nature for more than 20 years now. So many of us have actually been working very hard to develop vaccine platforms for viruses like coronaviruses and influenza viruses. So although COVID-19 itself was unexpected, we were always expecting, a major coronavirus pandemic. And so it's not that these vaccines were just created in an instant back in January last year. They were already very much in development on a general basis, and then when we knew the specific virus, we then slotted it in to our technology. So there's more than 20 years research has gone into these vaccines.
Dr. Nikolai, can you tell me, as you have a great role in development of these vaccines and the research behind this entire process, tell me about the various brands available and different technologies that are in use in different parts of the world, because we are not hearing similar names. There are different brand names everywhere. Can you tell us if there is any difference in all of these?
So, yes, we have more technologies available for COVID-19 than we've ever seen for any other disease. So we have the traditional technologies, particularly the vaccines being developed in China by the likes of Sinopharm, where they grow the COVID-19 virus and then they kill it with a chemical and then use that killed virus as a vaccine. That's very traditional. It's more than 100-year-old technology. You then have the vaccine platforms that companies like ourselves and Novavax are using, where we make synthetic proteins that are designed to look like the virus. They are the safest approaches, but they do take a little bit longer. And at the moment, we don't have an approved protein-based vaccine, but we're hoping that will happen in coming weeks. We then have the new platforms, particularly the adenovirus vector platforms developed by Oxford University and AstraZeneca that we've heard a lot about as they've been rolled out. And then we have the new mRNA, which are a completely new technology, hasn't been used in humans before, vaccines that are coming from the US, from particularly the companies Moderna and Pfizer. So we really have a lot of choice out there in terms of vaccine technologies. And of course, every technology has its pros and its cons. But the good news is they all seem to be working, although maybe some are more effective than others.
Dr. Nikolai, on this point, I would like to take in my program Dr. Waqar Ahmed, who is a doctorate and an economist from Oxford University. He serves in the one of the major think tanks in Pakistan. Dr. Waqar, welcome to the program. Tell me, from your economic perspective, how this entire episode of COVID-19 has affected the major economies in the world.
Thank you, Shabahat Ali Saab. And you have rightly asked the question that how corona vaccination will help the economies of major vaccine manufacturers. As we see now, China, US, EU, and India are going to be the lead gainers in economic terms, given that these are the economies who are leading manufacturers of the COVID-19 vaccine. Increased production and turnover is only one of the advantages. The other three are also important, which will give them an edge in future vaccine and pharmaceutical research and development. And these three benefits include, firstly, better integration with global procurement entities, global suppliers such as World Health Organization, Gavi, and other vaccine demanders who are arranging vaccine for low-income countries. Second, we're also noticing that investment from outside of these countries, which will start to pour in. For example, US would be investing in India, Japan and Australia would be investing in India. That investment going into companies in India, Germany, Belgium, that is also going to lead towards more joint ventures, joint investments, sharing of clinical data that that may actively also end up competing with other potential competitors. Third, these countries will be able to vaccinate their populations first, which means that those countries who are manufacturing COVID vaccine themselves would not only vaccinate their populations first, they will also be able to open up the economy fairly quickly. There will be early post-pandemic economic recovery for them, job creation for them, and many of the welfare losses which they have experienced, they would be able to redeem.
How the economies of scale, how the major economies of the world got affected with this COVID-19. And is it true that China has remained the only economy that remained scratchless from this entire crisis, have rather gained a lot after COVID?
This is an important question, that how economies of major countries have been affected by COVID, and whether China remained unaffected or was China affected as well. The data which we have now, of course, shows that India, EU region, and US were the worst hit, especially between April and June of 2020. The GDP growth of India, EU region, and US essentially contracted by over 9%. In India, this was much larger. And in comparison to April and June of 2019, it wasn't just the loss of GDP, but also job losses, which these three regions experienced. China also experienced a downturn, but China was able to recover fairly quickly. First, because they had an early experience of COVID-19. So their fall in GDP was prior to these months, which are April to June of 2020. Second, they went into a hard lockdown much before the rest of the globe. They imposed strictly monitored travel and cargo restrictions. Some of them are in place by now. Third, they were able to open up fairly quickly once, of course, the curve had flattened. Their industries were able to pivot better, as many of their industries, particularly in healthcare, were the first to provide testing kits to the world. So all in all, we see that during the April-June period last year, when the GDPs of all the major economies, their national income was facing a downturn, China experienced a 3.2% GDP growth between April and June months.
Dr. Nikolai, can you tell me about this problem of AstraZeneca? The entire international media is abuzz with AstraZeneca being paused, as they say, in various countries of Europe. And the vaccine is still working in many other countries. Do we have a central body that allows all these vaccines, or how is the regulatory mechanism working in this regard?
The regulatory mechanism for vaccines is country dependent. So every country has their own regulator, and they are free to make the decisions that are best for the people in that country. And we have to remember that vaccines are approved on a risk-benefit basis. No vaccine has zero risk. We like to think our own, of course, has minimal risk. But of course, we do get vaccine side effects with all vaccines. Obviously, a country that has a lot of deaths from COVID-19 are going to accept a vaccine that might have significant risks. A country such as Australia, for instance, where we have no COVID-19 deaths, is going to expect a vaccine to be extremely safe and have minimal side effects. So it's not surprising that some countries, right now may be saying the AstraZeneca vaccine, we want to be sure that the benefits justify the risks. Other countries are saying, look, we know people are dying of COVID-19. We're confident that this vaccine will save more people than it may affect with side effects. So that decision, I think, is very appropriately taken on a national basis by each regulator. It's not something that can be global because the circumstances in each country are so different.
But as you mentioned, Australia is quite ahead than other countries when it comes to the safety and the regulation mechanism. Can you share the success story of Australia, or what Australia is exactly doing? Are you developing your own vaccines, or are you importing it from somewhere? And if you are developing your own vaccines, are you giving it to some other countries in form of donations, as many other countries have done?
So look, I mean, Australia, it's called the lucky country, and so currently, we have no COVID-19 domestic transmission. We do have people coming to Australia who have COVID-19, but they're in quarantine facilities. So we have no domestic transmission. Now, partly that may be luck, partly good strategy. We were one of the first countries in the world to ban flights from China and ultimately from other countries that were COVID affected, and then actually imposing a national quarantine system on all travellers to Australia, no matter which country they came from. I think that was very sensible, and I think the countries that didn't impose travel restrictions are the countries that have suffered worst. So I think that was actually good decision making very early in the pandemic. And then, we've had hard lockdowns in some states whenever there's been an outbreak, that there's been fairly, quick, decisive action. And we know that hard lockdowns, implemented quickly before the virus really gets into the community, are much more effective than waiting till there's a lot of virus and then trying to get rid of it. So this virus is, once you let the genie out of the bottle, it's very hard to put the genie back into the bottle. And so I think with this virus, what we've learned is you need very hard, decisive action at the very first signal that there's a case of the virus. And the countries that have been slow to react have really suffered the worst. In terms of vaccines and Australia's role in vaccines, in fact, we have a very slow rollout, mainly because, again, we don't have a lot of virus. So there's been less pressure to roll a vaccine out. And so at the moment, Australia is not in a position to provide vaccine to other countries. We're actually predominantly reliant on supply from Pfizer, which is the first vaccine that was approved in Australia, but obviously everyone in the world wants the Pfizer vaccine, so we're only getting a small amount. And the second vaccine that was approved just recently is the AstraZeneca vaccine, which people maybe are less keen to have than the Pfizer vaccine, but is in greater supply. So both those vaccines are currently available in Australia.
Dr. Nikolai, let me have a word with Dr. Vakar about it. Dr. Vakar, Australia is one of the countries that, in collaboration with Japan, India, and United States, have decided to make India a manufacturing hub and to finance the manufacturing of American vaccines in India. How do you see this development, and how do you think it is going to affect the regional economy?
I think we are now looking that India is gearing up to expand vaccine production in the coming days. There is an announcement that the manufacturing of vaccines of US design in India will take place with funding from US, Australia, and Japan. Uh, so this is the quad, as we call it, US, India, Australia, Japan, and they're trying to ramp up the vaccine production. For US, Australia, and Japan, this is also a good business proposal, as India will have a large demand for vaccines of its own uh, and within its own country. But also, India, in close proximity to other Asian economies with large populations, will be in a position to sell these vaccines. And according to the plan, 1 billion doses will be produced by India. So it's not just the favorable health impact which the Quad is aiming for, but also a good return on their investment. And what they're also trying to do is to protect from being in a position where some other vaccine providers, most notably China or Russia, achieve a position where there's a monopoly of future vaccine supplies. So from their point of view, they don't want to be in that position. But China has already responded, and China has said that globally all countries should refrain from making such vaccine production blocks, and all should cooperate in terms of knowledge and technology transfer and sharing of clinical data.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bakar. Thank you very much, Dr. Nikolai, for being in my program. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break here and we'll join you soon with the second segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back. So we have in our program from Karachi, Dr. Professor Saeed Khan, PhD in postdoctorate from University of Washington, Professor of Pathology at Dove University of Health Sciences. And with him, I have Syed Tajamul Hussain. He is CEO of one of the largest data management and analysis companies in the country called LFT. Tajamul and Dr. Saeed, welcome to the program. Tajamul, my first question. Tell me how the current situation of COVID is going internationally as well as in Pakistan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much, Shabahat, for inviting me to your show, Fault Lines. So currently, as you may know, the world is progressing through two different phases. At one stage, we are looking at the vaccination stage, where globally more than 114 million people have been vaccinated. And on the other hand, we have countries like Pakistan that are going through the third wave of COVID-19. So it's a mix and match of where proactive and reactive stages can be seen in different countries globally.
Okay, Dr. Saeed, since you're working on the medical side of it, can you tell me what vaccines are being used in Pakistan, and can you tell us about the proportion of different vaccines that we are using at the moment?
Assalamu alaikum, Shabbat. Thank you for inviting me on Fault Lines. Currently, 4 vaccines being approved by the government of Pakistan after the committee of experts under the draft. These 4 vaccines are Sinopharm, Sputnik 5, AstraZeneca, and CanSino. But at the moment, only Sinopharm vaccine is administered, and it's already been administered to the frontline workers, the health workers, the doctor, and the paramedics. And now it is in use for the elderly person whose age is above 60 years of age. and gradually this age will be reduced, and the vaccine will be available for masses. It will be used on large scale.
As you are working very closely with the media management, and you're working first-handedly on the social media data as well, tell me about this resistance against vaccines, which we have seen coming up as a global phenomenon everywhere. I was watching a report that says that in France, 48% people are actually resisting. There are protests already in countries like Uruguay and Brazil. How this phenomena of resistance on the social media is coming in Pakistan, and how rampant do you think it is at the moment?
Especially when you have controversies coming around drugs like AstraZeneca, where they're being able to uh, give blood clots to patients, and at the same time, reports that their factories and warehouses in Italy have doses that are being questioned and have been found by the law enforcement authorities in the large quantities to be lying there. So we have such uh, cases going on one end, and on the other side, we have religious and fundamental groups that have questions in place around whether one should be vaccinated in the first place or not. So we have, if we look at the social media data, there are 3 to 4 categories that go against vaccination in the first place. Number one, religious groups, and they're in all communities that are strictly telling their followers not to get vaccination done. And government of Pakistan, by the way, is taking strict action against it. And you'll see that before and during Ramzan, government has campaigns planned around people should get themselves vaccinated. And ulama and religious scholars are moving forward on that side in Pakistan. However, that remains a reason for people not to get vaccinated globally. Number two, you find people who have medical background and who give out theories such as the long-term and short-term side effects of vaccine, and that plays a vital role for a lot of people to move away from vaccination. The third being the structure of the vaccine itself. A lot of times there are researchers all the way coming from Taiwan and Chinese who question the vaccine and its formulation in the first place. So these are 3 core reasons that are labeled out. Chinese government has played a very strict role, and Taiwanese people who were posting against the vaccine, they have now sent out apology messages to the Chinese government and to the manufacturers of the vaccine. But overall, globally, it still remains debatable.
Dr. Said, tell me how different variants or how different waves of coronavirus are affecting Pakistan. We have heard from a common man's perspective that there are different variants of this germ that is coming to Pakistan, and we have also heard that the latest spring has come from United Kingdom. Can you enlighten us a bit about it?
Coronavirus is an RNA virus, which means it's keep on changing its genome with rapid replication. It's accumulating different mutations, and after a certain time, the mutations reach to the level that it's become a new variant. So the variants which are already known, the UK variants, the South African variants, and the Brazilian variants. These variants are of importance because they spread very fastly, and they can affect the person more severely as compared to the normal coronavirus. Some of these variants may also escape from the immune system, and they can deceive the immune system. So in that case, the antibodies produced naturally or by vaccine may not be that effective, and we may also miss them during the diagnosis. So we need to keep eye on these variants. We need to identify these variants, and person who are infected with these variants should be isolated as soon as possible, so the virus should not be spread. Otherwise, some of these variants like the UK variants, which is already been identified in Punjab, and they are spreading more fastly than the previous variant viruses that we were having in Pakistan. So we need to curtail this pandemic, particularly in Pakistan, by identifying these variants and restricting the virus not to spread further.
Tajamul, coming back to you, as you're looking into this data and advising NSOC about it as well, we do not have this religious problem, as you mentioned, in the West, but still the resistance in the Latin America and even in some parts of Europe is quite rampant. Do you see there are any other reasons, or perhaps making mandatory or should-ifying this vaccine is a problem, and linked to it? Also, tell me why major social media outlets are not taking any actions against those who are spreading the false information, since it is a global issue.
Thank you, Shabbat, for your question. So primarily, the social media companies label it under the freedom of speech, and they let people voice their opinion accordingly. And this is not something that they've currently labeled under an infringement, else they would have taken an action. Now, when we talk about fundamentalists, religious or otherwise, are stepping up against getting vaccinated in Europe. There are movements that go by the name of free mask, no mask, that actually convince people not to have masks on and enjoy their freedom. The same movements are now also labeling vaccination as part of a larger conspiracy of being controlled by some unknown authorities and events. So these groups, you'd be surprised to know, exist in a lot of educated countries as well. And we see them coming from US, Europe all the time. And their supporters, their followers are there in millions on social media platforms.
Okay, Tajamul, you very rightly mentioned that this is perhaps got nothing to do with the religion, but it's more embedded into the human psyche. And since it's a global issue, we are seeing this response also coming globally. Dr. Saeed, tell me about, since we are talking on the international scale, tell me about this vaccine trials in Pakistan. Are we having any other vaccines being trialed at the moment? And more importantly, are the vaccines available to the people who want to travel abroad, or for any reasons, if someone want to get this vaccine injected, not being in the age bracket that the government is prioritizing at the moment? What is our policy about it?
At the moment, Sinopharm is available under the government policy, and it's available for public and government hospital or government approved settings. But with passage of time, more vaccine will be arrived and it will be privately available. At the moment, the government has allowed a few of the pharma company who purchase the two vaccine, that is Sputnik 5 and CanSino, which will be available for public under the government policy to be used and purchased by public, and they can use it. But at the moment, only the Sinopharm is available, and it is used under the rule of the or the policy of the government.
Thank you very much, Sayyid Tajamul Hussain, for being my guest. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break here and we'll join back in the third and last segment of the program with our guest in studio. Stay with us. Welcome to the third and last segment of the program. In this segment, I have my guest in studio, a famous political economic analyst, Sultan Ali Haider. Sultan, welcome to the program.
Many thanks, Shiva.
Tell us about this vaccine diplomacy of China. It has become a major headline of international media outlets. Can you enlighten us a bit about it?
So first of all, the most interesting aspect is that the word diplomacy has been associated to that, right? Which, if you think in itself, means that there's some ulterior motive behind all of what is happening in terms of sharing vaccines, doing research. It all goes back to, if we start, a disease started. It happened to start in China. However, instead of seeing China as a victim, the world sort of started blaming China, so it's blame the victim. So it calling it the Chinese virus and things like that, rather than world coming to aid
Donald
China.
Trump took a lead on that.
Exactly. So in response to that, last year what started happening was that while China very aggressively went in and controlled its virus, it started sending out masks, for example, right? Masks were in great demand. China had the production facilities. And then that is the time when we saw the first reaction, the world reacting, or rather the Western world reacting to that negatively. So that in the third world, or for some neutral people, that was quite strange, China is doing something nice. Why is the Western world reacting to that? The issue is that the Western world saw that they had vacated this empty space where it was the Western world which would come as a savior to the rest of the world. And China was doing that while the Western world could not do that. Rather, China was sending it to Europe, which is a developed world. That is where this whole concept started. And it was the West's reaction to China occupying that space. And now again, so fast forward to 2021, China is sending its vaccines, but now the Western world is also competing. And who sends the vaccine to who first? That is the whole game which is happening.
So what is actually happening behind the curtain, and how do you think it is going to affect the global politics?
So behind the curtain, what is happening is that now, as your program's title says, fault lines, so now we have a fresh fault line on vaccines. Nobody thought of it before, on health issues. So it is seen as a competition. Whoever can produce the vaccines faster, whose vaccine is better, and who can get the vaccines faster to others, who is suffering but is still able to help others. So those are the fault lines which are in place, and that is where the whole game is being played. So for example, when the virus hit, China was the victim, but then China was able to overcome. US, when it hit the US, the death rate in US spiked up. Initially it was Europe, then US went way ahead. So it was whether US can control the pandemic, right? It was resilience of United States.
We'll come to US in the later question, but as you said,
Yeah.
initially the West had blamed that there's a curtain on information in China. It's not as good as it's told, but then we have heard that China is entirely open. They are operating in a normal lifetime. So how do you comment on this?
So it's essentially a war of narratives, right? So I think one doesn't need to get too much into that, but it's what you are saying versus what I'm saying. So in terms of reality, as you are saying, China wasn't as bad. So they doubted whether China was doing really good. So irrespective of whatever facts on the ground, but yes, China was still functioning, right? So it wasn't that there was a complete blackout of information, right? So again, that is why one should not be reading too much into these things. Mm-hmm. And what we should be looking at is in terms of what are the actual facts on ground, and then we can build from that. If you can put up the first exhibit on the screen. Now, if you look at that, 14 of the vaccines are approved globally. So now the data that I'm sharing is from UNICEF, right, and World Health Organization. And 21 billion doses are to be produced. Globally. Out of which countries have secured supplies of 10.6 billion vaccines, right? Of which 3.56 are for COVAX, which is essentially a consortium of vaccines funded by developed countries to go into the developed world, which cannot afford these. Now, and the price of vaccine is from $2 to $44. It's that range. So it tells you that there's enough supply coming to get you and me vaccinated 2-3 times over, right? So there isn't really a long-term issue on that, and that is where the diplomatic thing comes up.
So have United States and Europe been outsmarted by China when it comes to the global vaccination diplomacy?
I wouldn't say outsmarted. You may call it caught napping, like if you think of it from a political angle, it is like there was this empty space, the West wasn't coming in, and China came and occupied that space. They were more enterprising. Rather, or in another way, what you can say is West thought that we will do, and China and Russia will be waiting for us. China and Russia also invested, and they also developed the vaccines. Now, this is where the politics bit comes in, where US is very sensitive or the West is sensitive. or China or Russia may also be very sensitive. It is that who is the developed country, who is the leader, right? So if Russia is able to develop the vaccine on its own, China is able to develop it on its own. So rather than Western Europe going to Russia and Russia suffering and asking for help from its Western cousins, it is Russia which is supplying. So that is where its whole brand image, right, which is a stronger power. So that is the image and the war of narrative, because the other narrative of developed countries and developing countries, that is where it's get really
Sultan,
fractured.
Europe, United States, Russia, China have been the trendsetters in the world. It's nothing new. But now we are seeing India taking the lead. We are seeing United States giving a lead to India into the equation,
Yeah.
and Australia and Japan becoming the financiers of the American-made vaccines to be established, to be made in India. How do you see this from your political economic angle?
So it is, okay, disease doesn't know nationality, right, or gender or anything. So disease is spreading across the world. Now in disease and fighting the disease and vaccines, we are imposing the political map. So political map is, yes, China-US conflict, right, or US seeing China as gaining too much power, right, and replacing it. So then you have Quad, as you mentioned in the intro to your program. So it is China, Russia, on one side, and you have United States trying to contain China along with Japan, India, and Australia. So you are trying to, or they are trying to impose that. So now how do you compete for influence in this region? It is you get the factories based in India, you boost their capacity, you fund them, you buy vaccines from them, and then get those vaccines to be supplied to other countries. Interesting, what is happening in India at this point in time is that it's sort of competing interest, right? It can vaccinate its own population, while at the same time it can send those vaccines to other countries and compete with China. So for example, the flashpoints were you had Sri Lanka as a flashpoint, you had Bangladesh as a flashpoint, you had Nepal as a flashpoint.
China already giving vaccines to 45 countries. India has just begun.
Yes, but it is one country picking up either India's vaccine or China's. Who is the savior, right? So this is where the politics bit is coming in. Had this politics bit not started 1 year back, then it would have been very interesting. It would have been a very benign thing. It is something like there's this match or competition going on, whether media is putting some attention to that or not. So now it has become a very interesting match from that.
So how it is going to go forward from this point onward? We have so far discussed whatever has already happened and is already known to the public. We have analyzed it a bit, but how do you foresee things going forward from here?
So if you can put up the second graph, which is about the vaccine production, right? So we can see that 7.4 billion vaccines are to be produced in the first half of 2021. Another 13.8 billion in the second half of 2021, right? Next year going forward, capacity is going to be 37 billion onward, right? So there are going to be ample vaccination. Another very critical point to understand is, I've heard some of the American analysts talking about it, technical analysts, not political analysts. It is that at the end of the day, the vaccine is supposed to protect you, number one, from death, number two, from hospitalization. So if you break it down from political angle, let's look at it from Pakistan or any other developing country, right? We want to protect our population from death rate, right? So we want to lower the death rate. Number two, we want to reduce the load on hospitals in terms of ICUs. So even if you have vaccines from ABC, any other origin, which has lower efficacy, 60-65%, efficacy is in terms of deaths. It's not in terms of impact. So in terms of having its impact in reducing the severity of the illness, right? That brings the political context. So the greatest political impact going forward will be that developing country realizing, number one, they're very important, right? Because West is trying to court them, China is trying to court them, Russia is trying to court them. They're also realizing they're very important markets, because all of them are trying to get their orders. They have developed their vaccines. Now they want markets to sell those vaccines, right? So I think one interesting outcome can be countries realizing, African countries realizing they're very important. Other Asian countries,
they're all important markets.
They're a very important market. If you read analysts from the US, they will be trying to portray, you read Bloomberg, it will be like China is evil and it's using this, to convince. When I read that, I was like, okay, so if US was doing that, so US also had ulterior motives for the last 50, 60 years when it was doing all of the good things, right? So it will be very interesting. I think third world would, in diplomatic context, political context, they'll become more aware of their importance.
Thank you very much, Sultan, once again for being in this program. You are always very enlightening. Ladies and gentlemen, the corona pandemic is not so far going anywhere. The global economies will have to deal with it, and so will be the global politics. It is now on the countries that have a manufacturing industry to see how would they cope up with the crisis, and how soon and how swift they can transform the ways of their working and take advantage of the new opportunities that have arisen with the threat underneath. We'll join next week once again with another international issue in the same program. Stay with us and keep watching PTV World. Allah Hafiz.